The cafe smelled of cinnamon and broken promises. Sarah checked her phone for the 47th time, watching the minutes crawl past 8 o'clock, then 8:15, then 8:30. Around her, couples leaned across tables, sharing desserts and dreams, while she sat alone with a cold latte and the growing certainty that she'd been stood up. Again, she'd almost given up on love entirely after her divorce 3 years ago, but her best friend Maya had been relentless, practically forcing her to download the dating app, to fill out the profile, to say yes when David_Chicago suggested meeting at this downtown cafe. What's the worst that could happen? Maya had asked. Sarah could think of 100 answers now, each one more humiliating than the last. But she waited anyway, because somewhere deep inside, beneath all the scarred tissue and cynicism, she still believed in second chances. When the door finally opened at 8:45, Sarah looked up reflexively, expecting nothing. What she saw instead stopped her heart mid-beat. Michael, her ex-husband, the man she'd divorced after 7 years of marriage, stood in the doorway, scanning the room with the same nervous energy she remembered from their first date a decade ago. His hair was grayer at the temples now, and he'd grown a beard, but those eyes, those warm brown eyes that had once promised her forever, were unmistakable. Their gazes locked across the crowded cafe, and Sarah watched recognition dawn on his face, followed by shock, then something that looked dangerously close to hope. He walked toward her table slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. Sarah. His voice cracked slightly on her name. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, she managed, her throat tight. I'm supposed to be meeting someone. A blind date. Michael's face went pale. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled. Then he looked at her profile picture on the app, a recent photo Maya had taken, where Sarah's hair was longer and highlighted, where she wore the red dress Michael had never seen. David, he said quietly. That's my middle name. I've been using it since the divorce. Started fresh with everything. The coincidence was almost laughable. Almost. Out of 8 million people in the Chicago metropolitan area, out of thousands of users on that dating app, the algorithm had matched her with the one man she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. I should go, Sarah said, gathering her purse. But Michael reached across the table, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand. Please, he said. Don't. I know this is. I know. But you waited 2 hours. The least I can do is buy you dinner. No expectations. Just, let me do this one thing right. Sarah should have said no. Every instinct told her to run, to protect the fragile piece she'd built from the ruins of their marriage. But something in his voice, a humility that hadn't been there before, made her pause. 1 hour, she said finally. Then I'm leaving. They moved to a quieter corner booth, and an awkward silence settled between them as they studied menus they weren't really reading. Finally, Michael set his down. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one, not the defensive garbage I gave you during the divorce. Sarah's grip tightened on her menu. Michael, that was 3 years ago. We don't need to. I was a terrible husband, he continued, as if he'd been holding these words in for years and they were finally breaking free. I put my career first, my ego first, everything first except you. You asked me to come to your sister's wedding, and I missed it for a client dinner. You begged me to go to counseling, and I said we didn't need it. You told me you felt invisible, and I told you that you were being dramatic. His voice cracked. You weren't being dramatic. You were drowning, and I was too selfish to throw you a lifeline. Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes. She'd imagined this conversation 1,000 times, screaming at him, listing every hurt, making him feel a fraction of the pain she'd carried. But now, faced with his raw honesty, all she felt was tired. Why now? She asked. Why is David_Chicago on a dating app ready to be vulnerable when Michael couldn't do it in 7 years of marriage? Because I lost everything that mattered, he said simply. After you left, I threw myself even deeper into work. Made partner at the firm. Got the corner office, the ridiculous salary, everything I thought I wanted. And you know what? I was miserable. Completely, utterly miserable. He laughed bitterly. I'd come home to my expensive apartment, order takeout, and realize I had nobody to share it with. Nobody who cared if I'd had a good day or a bad day. Nobody who knew I liked my coffee with too much cream or that I'm terrified of thunderstorms. You're still afraid of thunderstorms. Sarah asked, surprised by the small smile tugging at her lips. Terrified, he admitted. Last month, I actually called my mom during one. I'm 42 years old. Despite everything, Sarah laughed. It felt strange, laughing with Michael again, like speaking a language she'd thought she'd forgotten. The waiter arrived, and they ordered. Michael remembered she loved the caprese salad, and Sarah remembered he always got his burgers medium rare, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about the divorce or the pain or the wasted years, but about everything else. Michael had started volunteering at a youth center, teaching kids from low-income families about financial literacy. Sarah had gone back to school and was finishing her degree in social work. They talked about movies and books and the ridiculous new coffee shop that had opened on Michigan Avenue where everything cost $12 and came with a 20-minute lecture about bean origins. As they talked, Sarah realized something that made her chest ache. This version of Michael, humble, self-aware, genuinely interested in her life, was the man she'd always hoped he'd become. But he'd only become this person after she'd left. I did therapy, Michael said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. Twice a week for 2 years. It was hell, having to face all the ways I'd screwed up, all the patterns I'd learned from watching my dad ignore my mom. He looked down at his hands. My therapist asked me once what I'd say to you if I could. I told her I'd tell you that you were right about everything. That I'm sorry. That you deserved so much better than what I gave you. Michael. Sarah's voice was soft. I'm not telling you this because I want you back, he said quickly. I know I don't deserve that chance. I just wanted you to know that leaving me was the best thing you could have done. For you, yeah, but also for me. You forced me to look at myself, really look, and I hated what I saw. But it made me want to change. He met her eyes. You made me want to be better. The hours stretched to 2, then 3. They talked about their families. His parents had finally divorced after 40 years of quiet misery, her sister had just had twins. They talked about regrets and lessons learned and the strange way life never quite turns out how you expect. When the cafe manager gently informed them they were closing, Sarah was shocked to see it was nearly midnight. They walked out into the cool Chicago night, the city lights reflecting off the river, and stood awkwardly on the sidewalk. Thank you, Sarah said finally. For apologizing. For being honest. For this. Thank you for staying, Michael replied. He hesitated, then pulled out his phone. Would it be okay if I deleted your number? From the app, I mean. I don't want you to think I'm trying to manipulate you or engineer more coincidences. Sarah considered this. The old Michael would have kept the connection, would have seen it as an advantage to exploit. This Michael was offering to let her go completely. Keep it, she said, surprising herself. Not for dating, not for anything romantic, but maybe as friends. Eventually. The hope that bloomed across his face was almost painful to witness. I'd like that, he said quietly. More than you know. They parted with an awkward hug that lasted a moment too long and not nearly long enough. As Sarah walked to her car, she realized she wasn't angry anymore. The resentment she'd carried for 3 years had somehow dissolved over caprese salad and honest conversation. She didn't know if she could ever love Michael again, didn't know if trust could be rebuilt from ashes. But she knew something important had happened tonight. They'd both become better versions of themselves, separately, painfully, but genuinely. Maybe that was enough. 6 months later, Sarah would meet Michael again, this time intentionally, for coffee. They'd talk about their lives, about growth and change and the possibility of second chances. But that night, driving home through the sleeping city, Sarah simply felt grateful. Grateful she'd waited those 2 hours. Grateful for the impossible coincidence. Grateful that sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you need in the most unexpected package. She'd gone looking for a new beginning and found something better, closure, forgiveness, and the radical realization that people could change. That kindness could emerge from heartbreak. That the end of one story could, somehow, become the beginning of healing.